Hello, and welcome to Screaming in the Cloud with your host, Chief Cloud Economist at the Duckbill Group, Corey Quinn. This weekly show features conversations with people doing interesting work in the world of cloud, thoughtful commentary on the state of the technical world, and ridiculous titles for which Corey refuses to apologize. This is Screaming in the Cloud.
This video is sponsored by Teleport.
It seems like there's a new security breach every day. Are you confident that an old SSH key or shared admin account isn't going to come back and bite you? Of course you're not, because this isn't your first day working with computers, and you're not a dangerous liability to yourself and those around you. Since you're responsible, check out Teleport. Teleport is the easiest, most secure way to access all of your infrastructure. The open source Teleport access plane consolidates everything you need for secure access to your Linux and Windows servers, Kubernetes clusters, databases, and internal applications like the AWS Management Console, that Jenkins box you swore you'd replace 3 years ago, GitLab because GitHub is just too mainstream, Grafana because to hell with it, you're building your own Datadog, Jupyter Notebooks because Python dependencies are the devil's work, and more. Teleport's unique approach is not only more secure, it also improves developer productivity. To learn more, smash the link below and also the like and subscribe buttons while you're mucking around down there and not looking at me like you should be doing.
Welcome to Screaming in the Cloud. I'm Corey Quinn. A year or two before the pandemic hit, I went on a magical journey to a mythical place called Australia. I know, I was as shocked as anyone to figure out that this was in fact real. And while I was there, I gave the opening keynote at a conference that was called Latency Conf, which is great because there's a heck of a time zone shift, and I imagine that's what it's talking about. The closing keynote was delivered by someone I hadn't really heard of before, and he started talking about single table design with respect to DynamoDB, which, okay, great, let's see what he's got to say. And the talk started off engaging and entertaining and a high-level overview, and then got deeper and deeper and deeper, and I felt, can I please be excused? My brain is full. That talk was delivered by Rick Houlihan, who now is the Director of Developer Relations for Strategic Accounts over at MongoDB, and I'm fortunate enough to be able to get him here to more or less break down some of what he was saying back then, catch up with what he's been up to, and more or less suffer my slings and arrows. Rick, thank you for joining me.
Great. Thanks, Corey. I really appreciate you brought back some memories, trip down memory lane there. And actually, interestingly enough, that was the world's introduction to single table design. That was my dry run rehearsal for reInvent 2018, was where I delivered that talk, and it has become since the most popular.
This was 2 weeks before reInvent, which was just a great thing. I'd been invited to go. Why not? I figured I'd see a couple of clients I had out in that direction. And I learned things like Australia's a big place. So doing a 1 week trip, including Sydney, Melbourne, and Perth, don't do that.
I had no idea that it took so long to fly from one side to the other, right? I mean, that's a long plane.
Oh, yeah. And you were working at AWS at the time, so
Absolutely.
I can only assume that they basically stuffed you into a dog kennel and threw you underneath the seating area, given their travel policy.
Well, I have actually at the time, they just upgraded the policy to allow the intermediate seating, right? So if you wanted to
big spender.
Yes, I could get the little bit of extra leg room so I didn't have to have my knees shoved into somebody's back, but it was good.
So let's talk about, I guess, we'll call it the elephant in the room. You were at MongoDB, yes, where you were a big proponent of the whole NoSQL side of the world. Then you went to go work at AWS, and you carried the good word of DynamoDB far and wide. It made an impression. I built my entire newsletter pipeline production system on top of DynamoDB. It has the same data in 3 different tables because I'm not good at listening or at computers. But right now you're back at Mongo, and it's easy to jump to the conclusion of, oh, you're just shilling for whoever it is that happens to assign your paycheck. And at this point, what's the authenticity story? But I've been paying attention to what you've been saying, and I think that's a bad take because you have been saying the same things all along since before you were on the Dynamo side of it. I do some research for this show, and you've been advocating for outcomes and the right ways to do things. How do you view it?
that's basically the story here, right? I've always been a proponent of NoSQL. The knowledge, it was interesting. The knowledge I took from MongoDB evolved as I went to AWS, and I delivered, thousands of applications and deployed workloads that I'd never even imagined I would have my hands on before I went there. I mean, honestly, what a great place it was to cut your teeth on data modeling at scale, right? I mean, there is no greater scale. That's when you learn where things break. And honestly, a lot of the lessons I took from MongoDB, well, when I applied them at scale at AWS, they worked with varying levels of success, and we had to evolve those into the sets of design patterns, which I started to propose for DynamoDB customers, which have been highly effective. I still believe in all those patterns. I would never tell somebody that they need to drop everything and run to MongoDB. But, again, all those patterns apply to MongoDB too, right? I wouldn't say all of them, but many of them, right? So I'm a proponent of NoSQL. And I think we talked before the call a little bit about, if I was out there hawking relational technology right now and saying RDBMS is the future, then everybody who criticizes anything I say, I would absolutely have to, say that there's some validity there. But I'm not saying anything different I've ever said. MongoDB announced serverless, if you remember, in July, and that was a big turning point for me because the API that we offer is the developer experience for MongoDB is unmatched. And this is what I talk to people now. It's the patterns that I've always proposed. I still model data the same way. I don't do it any different. And I've always said, if you go back to my earliest sessions on NoSQL, it's all the same. It doesn't matter if it's MongoDB, DynamoDB, or any other technology. I've always shown people how to model their data in NoSQL. And I don't care what database you're using. I've actually helped MongoDB customers do their job better over the years as well.
One of the things that I know that was my own bias has always been that if I'm looking at something like that I'm looking at my customer environments to see what's there, I can see DynamoDB because it has its own line item in the bill. MongoDB is generally either buried in marketplace charges or it's running on a bunch of EC2 instances or it just shows up as data transfer. So it's not as top of mind for the way that I view things through the lens of, billing. Yeah. That does inform my perception, but I also know that when I'm talking to large scale companies about what they're doing, when they're going all in on AWS, number of them still choose things like Mongo. When I've asked them why that is, sometimes you get the answer of, legacy is what we built on before. Cool, sure. Great. Yeah. Other times it's we're not planning to leave, but if we ever wanted to go somewhere else, it's nice to not have to reimagine the entire data architecture and change the integration points start to finish because migrations are hard enough without that.
That's right.
And there is validity to the idea of a strategic exodus being possible, even if it's not something you're actively building for all the time, which I generally advise people not to do.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that have occurred over the last, couple of years that have changed the enterprise CIO and CTO's assessment of risk, right? Risk is the number one decision factor in a CTO's portfolio and a CIO's, decision-making process, right? What is the risk? What is the impact of that risk? Do I need to mitigate that risk or do I accept that risk? Okay. So right now, what you've seen is with COVID, people have realized that, on-prem infrastructure is a risk. Right. It used to be an asset. Now it's a risk. Those personnel that have to run that on-prem infrastructure, hey, what happens when they're not available? The infrastructure is at risk. OK, so offloading that to cloud providers is the natural solution. Great. So what happens when you offload to a cloud provider and IAD goes down or US East 1 goes down? We call it IAD, or we used to call it IAD internally at AWS when I was there because the regions were named by airport codes. But it's US East 1. How many times has US East 1 had problems? Do you want to really be the guy that every time US East 1 goes down, you're in trouble? What happens when people in US East 1 have trouble? Where do they go? Well,
down,
they go to what?
Generally speaking.
They go to, if they're well architected, right? If they're well architected, what do? They go to US West 2. Well, how much infrastructure does US West 2 have? So if everybody in US East 1 is well architected, then they all go to US West 2. What happens in US West 2? And I guarantee you, and I've been warning about this at AWS for years, there's a cascade failure coming. And it's going to be coming because we're well architecting everybody to fail over from our largest region to our smaller regions. And those smaller regions, they cannot take the load, and nobody's doing any of that planning. So, sooner or later, what you're going to see is dominoes fall. Okay. And it's not just going to be US East 1. It's going to be US East 1 failed, and the rollover caused a cascade failure in US West 2, which caused a cascade.
Because everyone's failing over during this event the same way.
So
and
now,
also, again, not to dunk on them unnecessarily, but when US East 1 goes down, a lot of the control plane services freeze up.
Oh, of course they do. Exactly.
And,
we're not single point of failure, right? Exactly. There you go, Route 53. Now, and that actually surprised me. You're using DynamoDB instead of Route 53 as your primary database. So I'm actually must have.
I had to move one workload off of Dynamo to Route 53 for this issue number because I have to practice what I preach.
That's right.
That was
exactly.
weird. It made the thing slower and a little bit less
a little bit
cachy.
clunky.
But
Yeah, sure. Okay, I can understand that.
But it made the architecture diagram a little bit more head scratching, right. And really that's what it's all about, getting the high score.
Right. So if you think about your data, right, I mean, would you rather be running on an infrastructure that's tied to a cloud provider that could experience these kinds of regional failures and cascade failures? Or would you rather have your data infrastructure go across cloud providers so that when one provider has problems, you can just go ahead and switch the light bulb over on at the other one and ramp right back up, right? And honestly, you run in active configurations and that kind of, deployment, design, and you're never going to go down. Now, in my case, I focus on strategic accounts. Right, strategic accounts are big. They're the potential to be our whale customers. Right, these are probably not customers who would be all that interested in serverless. Right, they're customers that would be more interested in provisioned infrastructure because they're the people that I talked to when I was at DynamoDB. I would be talking to customers who are interested in like reserved capacity allocations. Right.
I wanted to ask you about that. Your developer advocacy, which I get for strategic accounts, and I'm trying to wrap my head around why do strategic accounts are the big ones, potential to spend lots of stuff. Why do they need special developer advocacy?
Well, it's funny because one of the reasons why I started talking to Mark Porter about this, was the fact that, the overlap is really around the engagements that I ran when I was doing the Amazon retail migration, right? When Amazon retail started to move to NoSQL, we deprecated 3,000 Oracle Server instances. We moved a large percentage of those workloads, to NoSQL. The vast majority probably just were lift and shift into RDS and whatnot because they were too small, too old, not worth upgrading, whatnot. But every single tier, what we call tier one service, right? Every money-making service was redesigned and redeployed on DynamoDB, right? So we're talking about 25,000 developers that we had to ramp. This is back 4 years ago. Now we have like 75,000. But back then we had 25,000 global developers. We had a technology shift, a fundamental paradigm shift between relational modeling and NoSQL modeling. And the whole entire organization needed to get up to speed, right? So it was about creating a center of excellence. It was about operating as an office of the CTO within the organization to drive this technology into the DNA of our company. And so that exercise was actually incredibly informative, educational in that process of executing a technology transformation in a major enterprise. And this is something that we want to reproduce. And it's actually what I did for Dynamo as well, really, more than anything. Yes, I was on Twitter, I was on Twitch, I did a lot of these things that were kind of developer advocate activities, but my primary job at AWS was working with large strategic customers, enabling their teams, teaching them how to model their data in NoSQL and helping them cross the chasm, right, from relational. And that is advocacy, right? The way I do it is I use their workloads. I use the customers, project teams themselves. I break down their models. I break down their access patterns. When I leave, essentially, we'll do a whole day of design reviews. We'll walk through 12 or 15 workloads. And when I leave, these guys have an idea. How would I do it if I wanted to use NoSQL, right? I give them enough breadcrumbs so that they can actually say, okay, if I want to take it to the next step, I can do it without calling up and say, hey, can we get a professional services team in here, right? So it's kind of developer advocacy and it's kind of not, right? We're kind of recognizing that these are whales. These are customers with internal resources that are so huge, they could suck our developer advocacy team in and chew it up, right? So what we're trying to do is form a focus team that can hit hard and move the needle inside the accounts. That's what I'm doing. Essentially, it's the same work I did for AWS, for DynamoDB. I'm just doing it for, they traded for a new core quarterback. Let's put it that way.
So one thing that I find appealing about the approach maps to what I do in the world of cloud economics, where like in my own environment, our AWS bill is creeping up again. We have 14 AWS accounts, and that's a little over $900 a month now, which,
Sure.
big money, big money. In the context of running a company that no one notices or cares. And our customers spend hundreds of millions a year pretty commonly.
Okay.
So I see the stuff in the big accounts and I see the stuff in the tiny account here. Honestly, the more interesting stuff is generally on the smaller side of the scale, just because you're not going to have a misconfiguration costing a third of your bill when a third of your bill is $80 million a year.
That's correct. If you do, then that's a real problem, right?
Oh, yeah. So it's very much two opposite ends of a very broad spectrum.
Right.
And advice for folks in one of those situations is often disastrous to folks on the other side of that.
That's right. That's right. I mean, at some scale, managing granularity hurts you, right? The overhead of trying to keep your costs, but at the same time, it's just a different measure of cost. There's a different granularity that you're looking at, right? I mean, things below a certain, level stop becoming important when, when the budgets start to hit a certain scale or a certain size, right? Theoretically,
for certain workloads, things that I care about with my $1 a month Dynamo spend, if I were to move that to Mongo serverless, great. My considerations are radically different than a company that is spending millions a month on their database structure.
Well, that's right. It really,
we don't care about the pennies. We care about, is it going to work? How do we back it up? What's the replication factor?
And but also it's more than that. It's, for me, from my perspective, it really comes down to that, companies that are spending millions of dollars a year in database services. These are companies that are spending 10 times that, 5 times that in developers, expense, right? Of building services, maintaining the code that these services run. The biggest problem I had with MongoDB is the level of code complexity. It's just that it's a cut after cut after cut, right? And I the way I kind of describe the experience, and other people have described it to me. I didn't come up with this analogy. I had a customer tell me this as they were leaving DynamoDB. DynamoDB is death by 1,000 cuts. You love it. You start using it, you find a little problem, you start fixing it. You start fixing it. You start fixing it. You come up with the pattern, talk to Rick. He'll come up with something. He'll tell you how to do that, okay? And, how many customers that I would do this with, and it's honestly, they're 15-minute phone calls for me. But every single one of those 15-minute phone calls turns into 8 hours of developer time, writing the code, debugging it, deploying it over and over again, making sure it's working.
Have another 15-minute call with Rick, et cetera.
Another 50, exactly. And it's like, okay, that's, this eventually they just get tired of it, right? And I actually had a customer a big customer, tell me flat out, yeah, you proved that the DynamoDB can support our workload and it'll probably do it cheaper. But I don't have a half a dozen Ricks on my team, right? I don't have any Ricks on my team. I can't be getting you in here every single time we have to do a complex data model overhaul, right? And this was, granted, it was one of the more complex implementations that I've ever done. In order to make it work, I had to overload the freaking table with multiple access patterns on the partition key, something I had never done in my life. I made it work, but it was just, honestly, that was an exercise to me that taught me something. If I have to do this, it's unnatural, okay? And that's, what I mean? And honestly, there's API improvements that we could have done to make that less of a problem. It's not like we haven't known since the last, I joined the company that 1,000 WCUs per storage partition was pretty small. Okay. We've kind of known that for, since DynamoDB was invented. As a matter of fact, from what I know, and talking to people who were around back then, that was a huge bone of contention back in the day, right? 1,000 WCUs, 10 gigabytes. There were a lot of the PEs on the team that were going, no way, that's way too small. And then there were other people that were like, nah, nobody's ever going to need more than that. And, a lot of this was based on the analysis of
nothing ever survives first contact with a customer, particularly a customer who is not themselves deeply familiar with with what's happening under the hood. Like I had this problem back when I was a traveling trainer for Puppet for a while. It was great. Well, Puppet is obviously a piece of crap because everyone I talk to has problems with it. So I was one of the early developers behind SaltStack, and this is going to be a thing of beauty, and it'll be awesome. And that lasted until I saw the first time I saw what someone had done with it in the wild. It was, okay, that's how.
Choice. Yeah, I never thought about that. Right, happy path. We all love the happy path, right? As we're working with technologies, we figure out how we like to use it. We all use it that way. Of course, you can solve any problem you want the way that you'd like to solve it. But as soon as someone else takes that clay, they mold a different statue and you go, oh, I didn't realize it could look like that, right? Exactly. Yeah. One of the things that you said that I think it hit me really, and it's like the data model isn't something you think about. The data model is something that just happens, right? And you know what? That is a problem, because this is exactly what developers today think. They think they know the relational database, but they don't. You talk to any DBA out there who's come in after the fact and cleaned up all the crappy SQL that people like me wrote, okay? I mean, honestly, I wrote some stuff in the day that I thought, this is perfect. There's no way there could be anything better than this, right? Nice derived table, joins, inside. And you know what? Then here comes the DBA when the server's running at 90% CPU and 100% memory utilization and page swapping like crazy. And you're saying, we got to start sharding the data set. And, you know, my director of engineering at the time said, no. What we need is somebody to come in and clean up our SQL. I said, what do you mean? I wrote that SQL. He's like I said, we need someone to come in and clean up our SQL. I said, okay, fine. We brought the guy in. $1,500 an hour we paid this guy. I was like, there's no way that this guy's going to be worth that. A day and a half later, our servers are running at 50% CPU with 20% memory utilization. And we're thinking about, you know, canceling orders for additional hardware. This was back in the day before cloud. So, you know, developers think they know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing when it comes to the database, and don't think just because it's a relational database and they can hack it easier that it's better, right? You know, there's no substitute for knowing what you're doing. That's what it comes down to. So, you know, if you're going to use a relational database, then learn it. And honestly, it's a hell of a lot more complicated to learn a relational database and do it well than it is to learn how to model your data in NoSQL. So if you sit two developers down and you say, you learn NoSQL and you learn relational, 2 months later, this guy's still going to be studying. This guy's going to have been writing code for 7 weeks. Okay. So, you know, that's what it comes down to. You want to move fast, use NoSQL, and you won't have any problems.
And I think that's a good place to leave it. Yeah. If people want to learn more about how you view these things, where's the best place to find you?
You know, always hit me up on Twitter, right? I mean, at Houlihan Rick, that's my underbar Rick, that's my Twitter handle. And, you know, I apologize to folks who have hit me up on Twitter and gotten no response. My Twitter, as you probably have as well, my message request box is about 3,000 deep. So, you know, every now and then I'll start going in there and I'll dig through and I'll reply to somebody who actually hit me up 3 months ago. You know, if I get that far down the queue, it is a last in, first out, right? I try to keep things as current as possible.
My DMs are trash fire. Apologies as well. Of course, but links to it in the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it. It's always an education talking to you about this stuff.
I really appreciate being on the show. Thanks a lot. Look forward to seeing where things go.
Well, likewise.
All right.
Rick Houlihan, Director of Developer Relations, Strategic Accounts at MongoDB. I'm cloud economist Corey Quinn, and this is Screaming in the Cloud. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice. Whereas if you've hated this podcast, please leave a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice, along with an upset comment talking about how we didn't go into the proper and purest expression of NoSQL non-relational data, DNS text records.